I call Alistair Scott.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This afternoon is the first time I've had a chance to speak on this bill, and I'd like to acknowledge the work that I'd like to acknowledge the work and the common cause that the Select Committee has, which is, of course, to make sure that Kiwis come home safe from work. It's important to recognise that work because we all have that same goal, and I'd also like to recognise and acknowledge the people that have been here today and yesterday in the gallery, because, sir, we do kill too many people in New Zealand. There were people from victims of or people left behind from the Pike River disaster here today, 29 men lost. But we have to remember those that are affected by, but not just deaths, but by long-term injuries. And this bill goes a long way in helping that. Attitudes been talked about earlier from a number of parties. This is not going to change attitudes. This is the framework for which we can hang our legislation. Attitudes and culture have already begun. I think the Minister mentioned earlier that the forestry sector has already made large changes towards changing their attitude and culture. The marine industry, maritime operating safety regulations have been in place already for 1 year, and they're consulting again on and getting feedback. So again, an example of an industry that's taking the lead in health and safety in their work environment. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, the other examples are of industries that I've been involved with prior to coming into Parliament, whether large or small. On the agenda, health and safety was up there at the top of the agenda. So this is nothing new. This is no new approach to health and safety. It's already out there, and this is creating a strong framework and leadership from a legislative point of view. Common sense has already been discussed. The reasonable, practical nature determines or defines what common sense should be. Reasonable and practical. Common shared responsibility, which is what this part is about. Mr. Chair, the duties that each of the people in the PCBU or the workers are involved in. I'd like to highlight the SOP which relates to 29A2, a new 29A2, which helps clarify that the people are all responsible for each other's health and safety, but this clarifies to the extent to which that person has or would reasonably expected to have the ability to influence. So I think that addresses some of Mr. Robertson's concerns that he talked about in the first part, that it's where one has the influence, where one is a director of a company, they are not, for example, going to be able to influence what is directly happening on the day on the shop floor, whether a guy wears his steel cap boots or not. He can't be held responsible for that, assuming that all the other responsibilities he has as a director have been fulfilled. Similarly, the worker next to the guy on the workshop floor who is not wearing his steel cap boots, he has a responsibility and an obligation to perform his duty of care. And that primary duty of care for the worker is in Part 2. The other part of Part 2 I'd like to highlight is relating to the PCBU and to farm workers. I've had a lot of questions from farmers and farm workers around what their duties are as far as buildings, whether they have accommodation on the farm. And it is clear that the farm buildings are certainly the responsibility of the PCBU. That is where work is being taken place. But the main dwelling of the house on the farm is not part of the farm infrastructure. It is outside a workplace. The only other part of a farm that would be inside the workplace, Mr. Chair, is where there's accommodation made available to a worker only where it is difficult for that worker to seek accommodation elsewhere. So imagine a remote or a dock worker perhaps out in one of the dock conservation estates, or a farmer who's out in the middle of nowhere. Those buildings, those accommodations would be considered part of the workplace infrastructure.